Today we're going to talk about exceptions. What are they and how should you handle them? Exceptions are one of the most misunderstood topics by most software developers. You hear a lot of developers use this phrase, "it throws an error," right? So they'll say this whenever the app is not working as expected. But you should never say this. If you're saying it throws an error, you're confusing three different things, right? In some cases, people use this phrase to describe a compile error. In other cases, they are talking about an exception. And I've even seen one developer who was saying it throws an error to describe the application just showing an error message. So what is the difference between these three things? Well, a compile error is when your program won't even run because you accidentally told the computer to do something that doesn't make sense. So an example of this would be like an undeclared variable. So maybe you declared a variable called username, but then you try to reference the variable USR name, and the computer doesn't know which variable you're talking about because it's misspelled. So in that case, when you try to run your app, if it's a statically compiled language, you won't even be able to run the app. So maybe some of the confusion might be some people start coding in a dynamically typed language, at which point everything is a runtime error. So that might be how some of the confusion starts, but using a statically compiled language, these are different concepts. So the other concept is an exception, also known as a runtime error. So that's when your program is able to compile and run, but then something unexpected happened at runtime and your program doesn't know how to handle it. So maybe a hardware failure or something like that. And in the third case, the application just showing an error message, well, in most cases that could actually be the correct behavior. I mean, if there's an error message saying that a certain text box is required and you really did leave it blank, then seeing that error message means the app is working correctly in that case. So don't use this phrase, "it throws an error," because it means you're getting confused between these three different concepts. So let's dive deeper into what are exceptions. Well, one example is a null reference exception, right? You had a variable that was null and you tried to access its properties or call a function on that object. That's probably the only exception where it's due to a bug in your code. So you should have handled any variables that might be null at that point. But in most cases, most exceptions happen from hardware failures or something going wrong in an input-output operation. So if a web service call times out, that's probably the most common exception I've seen in business apps, or a database call timing out. Those are pretty common as well. Others could be like maybe a database server is offline or it's out of disk space, and offline could include like not reachable. So maybe if the network engineer made a change and moved a database server to a part of the network that's not accessible from your app server, like it's behind a firewall or something, that could be an example of database server being offline. Or maybe if you're doing some file output and you don't have permission to write to that file or folder, or the computer's out of disk space, that would result in an exception as well. But it's really any line of code could fail. These are less common, but let's say you're doing an arithmetic operation like adding two numbers together. You could get an arithmetic overflow, meaning that if the result of the addition is larger than your computer can understand, you get an exception. So there's a limit to the maximum integer size on any computer. And same thing with divide by zero. That would be another example of an arithmetic exception. Or even allocating a variable using the new keyword. It could result in an out-of-memory exception. So pretty much any line of code could fail, but it tends to be these I/O operations and hardware failures that are the most common causes of exceptions. So how do you catch exceptions? Well, one way is by using a try-catch statement. So this is a feature of object-oriented languages where the catch block is a section of code that is run when an exception happens. In my opinion, that's not a great language feature because when it jumps to the catch block, that's basically a go-to. So the error handling is not done using control structures like functions or if statements or loops. But that's the best practice that we have today in OO languages. So we're going to have to just go with it. In ASP.NET, we have a global exception handler. So for all your server-side code, you don't need to wrap every entry point in a try-catch statement. You can just have one file with a function that is run anytime an exception happens. The reason that's better is because you won't have to remember to wrap every entry point in a try-catch. And even if you do remember it every time, it's reducing your code quality because you're adding an extra level of nesting and some duplicate code. So in other environments, if they have a global exception handler, definitely use that instead of wrapping every entry point in a try-catch statement. And of course, there are some applications that don't catch exceptions. So in some cases, that could result in silent failure. Other times, the user could see the exception message. So depending on your IIS settings, or whichever web host you're using, you could allow the user to see the exception message, or they could just see an HTTP 500 message. But if you have it set up to show the exception message, that's actually considered a security risk. There could be information in the exception that could be useful to a hacker. But in most cases, even if it's just a regular user who sees an exception message, they probably won't understand it. Like, input string was not in the correct format. Most users aren't going to know what that means. And once you've caught the exception, how do you handle them? So you've written your empty catch block. What code are you going to put inside of that catch block? I believe the best way to handle it is to log the exception to a database. What most people do is they log the exception to a text file. And that's not ideal because typically the only person who has access to that file is a developer. So if something's not working in prod, the developer is going to have to stop their work and go check out this text file, which means connecting to a remote machine, browsing to the text file, opening the text file, scrolling through the text file. That's a lot of work, and it's a lot of time where you're not actually developing an application. So if you log it to a database, that would allow you to build a support dashboard. In other words, a website that shows you the content of the support database. And that way you could just have a support technician see what the exception is. Is it a web server that's timing out? Is it a database that's timing out? And you may need a developer to actually fix it, but at least the diagnosis could be done very quickly and maybe by someone who's not even a developer. So those are all the advantages of logging to a database. The reason why some people log to a text file is because they say that logging to the database could fail. Well, logging to the text file could fail as well. Right? If the machine is out of disk space, or if permissions got changed for some reason and your app is no longer allowed to write to that file, the risk of the logging failing is pretty much the same whether it's a database or a text file. And if you make it a local database, then it's definitely the same. So those are all the reasons why you should log your exceptions to a database. And once that exception is logged, what are you going to show to the user? Are you going to show them an exception message? Are you going to give them a silent failure? Well, neither of those are great. You want to show some generic error message like unknown error occurred. And again, yeah, the exception message could be a security risk if it's saying, could not connect to a database and shows the database name. That might be useful information for a hacker. So unfortunately, the user is going to submit a support ticket, or in a small company, maybe walk over to the developer's desk and interrupt them, but that is still the best way of handling exceptions. And so the biggest takeaway is to stop using this phrase, "it throws an error." It's meaningless because exceptions, compile errors, and error messages are three different things, and it really impedes communication with other developers when it's not clear which concept you're talking about. And the best practices are to use a global exception handler if your environment supports it, log to a database, and build a support dashboard. That's it for today. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, and share. See you later.